second speaker is Everett Messamore from Heidelberg University. Mr. Messamore lectures at Heidelberg Center for American Studies. He has a background in religious studies, history, and literature. He is a fellow of the research group entitled, this is long, Global Religious History from a Regional Perspective, Historicizing and Decentering Religious Identities in the 19th and Early 20th Centuries. His current research and writing focus on spiritualism and the language of universal religion in 19th century America. Everett Messamore will be speaking to us today on Swedenborgian correspondence, progression, and the arts, particularly in the writings of Andrew Jackson Davis, also known as the Poughkeepsie seer.
So what is a poet? The spiritualist seer Andrew Jackson Davis inquired in 1851. Combine the qualities of the patriot, the hero, and the legislator with a love of the sublime and the beautiful, and you have a poet. And he too is a reformer. The illumination of genius lights up the mysterious caverns of his soul and unfolds serene thoughts in the inmost sanctuary of his being. The sympathies of humanity expand his heart, and prophecies of future peace press his pen to utterance. Davis's grand description of a poet was not mere rhetoric. He believed that the true poet, like all true artists, was a prophetic revealer of divine truth. Attesting to the inner divinity of all humans, truth was discoverable within the interior of the soul. Like all great truths, those revealed by the poet were useful and lifted the human race, bringing it closer towards a union with the divine. In this regard, the poet was also a progressive reformer of society. The mode of revelation was secondary to the message and the truth it contained. Andrew Jackson Davis, popularly known as the Poughkeepsie seer, was born to poor parents in 1826 in Blooming Grove, Orange County, New York. After developing clairvoyant powers during experiments with mesmerism in 1843, Davis, a sickly and ignorant youth by his own account, rose to prominence for lectures given in a trance state and soon became a leading figure in the spiritualist movement. His first and most popular book of many was a collection of his trance lectures, published in 1847, entitled, rather longly, The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, and a Voice to Mankind. From the beginning, the influence of Swedenborg permeated Davis's system, which he called the harmonial philosophy. This presence of Swedenborgian doctrines in Davis's thought is well established by scholars and was immediately noticed by his contemporaries. Indeed, Davis himself claimed to have communicated with the spirit of Swedenborg. And prior to a falling out, he was endorsed by a new churchman and professor of Hebrew at New York University named George Bush. In the words of the communitarian John Humphrey Noyes, Davis was the great American Swedenborg. And for anyone who's not familiar with him, I'm happy to elaborate a little bit in the Q&A. What has received far less attention than Swedenborg's overall influence on Davis or the latter's considerable influence within spiritualism is the way in which Swedenborgian concepts supported Davis's broad and unifying understanding of the universe and human society. Despite being one of the most influential 19th century proponents of Swedenborg and a huge influence within spiritualism, Davis's beliefs about art and its role in his philosophy have never been studied. By contrast, scholars have extensively documented the importance of Swedenborgian correspondence for romantic writers such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, who believed that poetry could express the majesty of the invisible world and promote the same process of discovery in the reader as the poet has experienced. And yet, Davis's similarity to such writers is often very striking. Far less educated, he represents a popularized and radical strand of the same kind of thought. Understanding Davis's appropriation of Swedenborgian concepts is central to understanding how he conceived of true art and the true artist. I will be focusing mainly on Davis's two most obvious debts to the Swedish mystic, the doctrine of correspondence and an emphasis on progress, which is exemplified by a belief in increasingly perfect spiritual spheres. Through universal correspondence, true art was an outward expression of interior and divine principles. Through the law of progression, it was both governed by and a driver of a hierarchical universe. In this way, true art, like true religion, revealed the laws of nature and fostered social harmony, bringing humanity ever closer to its millennial destiny. In Davis's first work, as well as later ones, correspondence carried critical implications for humanity's access to the divine. Reminiscent of the spiritual sun described by Swedenborg, Davis declared that the universe was born out of an infinite sea of liquid fire, which carried the attributes of the deity. As such, everything contained the divine imprint on it and operated on the same underlying principles. The universe and humans represented a union between the interior essence, God, and an external expression, nature. Similar to Swedenborg's idea of influx, the central sun of the universe, God, or the great positive mind, as Davis called it, poured inspiration into human interiors like the rivets of a mighty fountain. Through their interior souls, humans possessed direct access to the laws of the universe, operating beneath the world of visible effects. Such inspiration expressed itself in different ways. Writing in 1859, Davis observed, "One man may be a poet, another a philosopher, another a governor, another a moralist. That is to say, one may be a Christ, another a Shakespeare, another a Newton, and another a Plato. But it is not the individual, it is the well-ascertained truthfulness of what they write that constitutes the true object of affection and reverence. Artists and poets, the same as great philosophers or prophets, received divine inspiration and communicated it in their works. Even the laws of art are in accordance with nature," Davis wrote in The Principles of Nature. The true artist contemplated the manifestations of nature and expressed them as symbols and types, shadowing forth to the mind the internal and invisible causes, and thus revealing the true underlying reality of the universe. The artist, Davis wrote, is an interpreter and a representative of nature. He is to address the feelings and attributes of the spirit through the medium of the senses, to refine and elevate them by representations of native purity and divine images. Underlying the unity of all types of knowledge, Davis remarked that the artist's contemplation of nature would bring convictions to his mind corresponding to the conclusions drawn from all paleontological sciences. Despite the insights of the artist, all attempts to capture the transcendent essence of nature were always doomed to fall short. The artist, Davis wrote, recognizes something infinitely surpassing that which he vainly supposed to be created by his skill. For nature, with a renewed reflection, impresses his mind with more intrinsic truth than is represented in his imitation, which is of a shadowy and evanescent a character. Having accepted this truth, the artist, he is contended if his production is a facsimile of that which does constantly develop itself to the senses. For all its beauty, a work of art was still just an external representation of interior truth and must be treated as such. Suggesting his view of aesthetics, Davis elaborated on how the artist ought to approach his painting. The artist understood that generals and universals are the only reliable evidence of truth in contemplating the boundless landscapes of nature. He finds that in detailing and particularizing, he spoils the grand and sublime effect that it is his intention to reproduce. The composition, in order to be effective, had to operate harmoniously and in a holistic fashion. The artist, he wrote, finds that the parts, the lights and shades, the distance and perspective, compose the whole, and that the whole is necessary to the parts. The whole combined presents the internal conviction that the effect must in quality and principle be like that which originally produced it. So acting in concert, the parts mirrored the greater harmony of the universe and suggested the truth of correspondence to the viewer. As Davis put it in 1851, pictures are thoughts upon canvas, just as the objects of nature are the thoughts of God. As nature is a mirror in which we see God, so is the picture a mirror in which we see nature. Understanding such causes and implementing them in society was central to Davis's understanding of what true religion was. He envisioned a Fourierist reordering of society involving different individuals performing tasks for which they were best suited in various associations which mirrored the associations that he believed existed in the spiritual world with angels. In the clerical association, clergy would cease sectarian strife and would instead accumulate science, art, theology, and philosophy, which they would make perfect and practicable. Stating the future role of the arts explicitly in 1859, he wrote, "Poetry, pictures, and music will take the place of sermons, pulpits, and prayers." Art in this line of thinking was as valid an avenue to truth as any other. In fact, the work of the prophet resembled that of the artist or the poet. Writing about Swedenborg, Davis noted that he saw into heaven and hell inferentially and analogically, not literally, just as Milton saw the Prince of Darkness and the splendid compartments of Pandemonium. By revealing the gap between natural principles and life as it was currently lived, the artist invited reform. He could perceive the great disconnection between nature's established laws and man's present ignorance, imperfection, and grossness, Davis wrote. The harmony visible in nature stood in stark contrast to the social ills which plagued humanity. However, a true artist understood that the universe is a symbol and could impart this truth to others. The first and ultimate of all things are rational and irresistible inductions that can be drawn from the prolific, fertile, and truthful experience and meditation of the true artist, Davis wrote. Not so with lesser individuals whose disorganized natures tainted their attempts at art. As Davis elaborated in 1852, the true artist sees harmony and unutterable beauty in the forms and colors of nature, but the superficial man, seeing neither as they are, throws into his composition an unnatural congruity and tints it with the grotesque colors of his own inharmonious thoughts. Because such superficial individuals could not perceive the true interior nature of the universe, they couldn't give it a living and useful expression for others to benefit from. Equally important to correspondence in Davis's understanding of the arts was the law of progression, which supposed a universe in which all things advanced and developed into higher forms. Like Swedenborg, Davis envisioned the existence of spiritual spheres beyond our own, though he rejected the idea of hell and claimed instead that each of the 6 spheres improved upon the previous one. Within each sphere, the angels, departed spirits, organized themselves into societies based on their respective levels of advancement. Following the logic of universal correspondence, this pattern of progressive hierarchies was replicated in every aspect of creation, from the ordering of the planets to the evolution of humans and their societies. Despite being a radical social reformer who affirmed the innate divinity of all humans, Davis nonetheless took a linear view of history and abridged a rigid scientific racism characteristic of the 19th century. As humans developed into higher types, their forms of government, theology, science, and other cultural expressions advanced in tandem. Progression interacted with what Davis referred to as the law of association, whereby like matter was attracted to like matter. As such, a more highly evolved people had more developed interiors and consequently possessed a closer affinity with the divine. Every historian, poet, philosopher, psychologist is a sort of representative of the greatness or littleness of the era in which he lived and worked, Davis wrote in 1859. These charts Davis provided in his 1857 autobiography, The Magic Staff, demonstrate the close relationship between different stages of development and their respective social and cultural expressions. A firm believer in America's millennial destiny, Davis placed Anglo-Americans and Republican government at the apex of his hierarchy. You can see also language, science, philosophy, theology all advance, as well as the type of government and art, of course. Art advanced from being lifeless, with simple outlines and rude, grotesque figures, to being living, denoted by soft, lively color, and being graceful, sentimental, spiritual, profoundly effective, and having an influence pure and refining. Such living art expressed unity. Lowly forms of discordant music gave way to harmonious ones, which were symphonious, euphonious, harmonious, lofty, delicate, expressive, and which possessed exquisite order and time. Poetry started at perceptism, which was external, wild, startling, and abounding with huge and stupendous fancies, such as genii, hunting, and war. It then progressed to intuitism, which was instructive, elevating, refining, the vehicle of truth, and the promoter of peace, progress, and unity. Notably, the highest forms of artistic expression possessed practical value for the human race. Art refines and spiritualizes the feelings, he wrote in the Great Harmonia, and opens the interior senses to the more glorious perception and appreciation of nature's beauties. Similarly, he observed, in this age, poetry, true poetry, is more universally understood and applied to practical purposes than formerly. As the soul and the human race approach the era of social and spiritual harmony, the principle of poetry, which is music and which is harmony, is more easily comprehended and practiced. In a two-way causal relationship, higher degrees of advancement produced more useful artistic forms, which in turn promoted human development. The birth of great individuals helped drive this process. The true reformer is superior to his age, Davis wrote, and artists and poets were as much reformers as any one other promoter of human interest. As with correspondence, the conclusions Davis drew often bore a strong similarity to Emerson, such as essays like The Poet, The American Scholar, and Representative Men. Like Emerson, Davis felt that certain individuals were more open to the immanent spirit of God than others. As such, Davis wrote, "The true artist is not understood. He has emotions and impulses which he cannot communicate with his tongue or pencil to the critic. The artist lives above the multitude." Such was the natural consequence of having certain individuals whose interiors were more opened to a greater degree than those of others. Who can perfectly comprehend Shakespeare's gentle muse without being similarly organized or situated, Davis queried, without having the same avenues of his soul opened in the same manner to the same sources of inspiration? Such poetical reformers, Davis felt, were rare indeed. Davis complained, "Our artists take the old masters for their standard. This devotion to man authority is disastrous to every attempt at progression in the science of revealing thoughts." The old masters, by contrast, represented their own thoughts and their own discoveries in the combinations of colors, and this independence made them great and immortal. We will have new masters when originality and independence of popular opinion inspires some refined and elevated spirit to express on canvas his own perceptions of the beauties of nature and his own intuitions of invisible things. Art that slavishly mimicked others could not be beautiful and useful because it did not reflect the interior nature of the world. Imitative art was nothing more than a shadow of a shadow. We have seen in this overview of Davis's theory of art how his theory of art was driven by concepts borrowed from Swedenborg. From a divine influx from the infinite fountain that was the great positive mind, human interiors received the underlying truths of nature in direct proportion to their degree of development. Just as the external world of nature corresponded to the interior principles of God, true artists, poets, and musicians symbolically replicated these principles in their art. In doing this, they contributed to the progression of the human race, which in turn produced higher forms of art. Attesting to the universality of divine inspiration, a poet or artist was as prescient as a prophet and as instructive as a philosopher. A couple of possible conclusions might be drawn from the clear parallels Davis's thought had to romantic writers like Emerson, though these conclusions are difficult to prove for reasons that Professor Hanegraaff kind of mentioned with the entanglement of spiritualism with other things. One likely possibility is that Davis was directly inspired by Romanticism. Later in his career, he, like other spiritualists, made his admiration for Emerson and Transcendentalism abundantly clear. However, Davis's claims to direct clairvoyant inspiration make his sources notoriously difficult to trace definitively. A second possibility is that the shared influence of Swedenborg on both romantics and spiritualists might help account for this similarity. Naturally, the two possibilities aren't mutually exclusive, as the compatibility of romantic thought with spiritualism might have made it especially appealing. I would like to just end with a quotation that nicely encapsulates Davis's universal understanding of inspiration, writing enthusiastically of an approaching period of peace and happiness, equally anticipated by the poet, the prophet, and the philosopher. He declared, "Poets are no dreamers, prophets are no impostors, seers are no visionists, philosophers are not insane. No, no. Poets have all sung of an Elysium, prophets have foretold of a new Jerusalem, seers have seen an era of universal unity, philosophers have ciphered out a new Atlantis, the millennial day, the utopian period, the reign of justice, the age of happiness. All, yes, all, are but one declaration of Father God through the several inspired offspring of Mother Nature." Thank you.